My name is Arthur Winslow. I am 93 years old. I served with the 705th Tank Destroyer Battalion, European Theatre, 1944 to 1945. I drove a vehicle that most of the army considered a coffin on tracks. Every man who climbed into one knew exactly what he was getting into. We did it anyway. December 19th, 1944. A frozen morning outside a Belgian village called Noville, north of Bastogne. The fog was so thick you could not see 30 yards in any direction. German Panther tanks from the 2nd Panzer Division were grinding south through that white nothing. 120 tanks and assault guns, 16,000 men, aimed at the crossroads the entire Ardennes offensive depended on. Between them and Bastogne stood a handful of American tank destroyers that weighed 18 tons and carried armor so thin the crews joked it was only there to keep the wind out. Those were M18 Hellcats, and on that morning they did something that German intelligence could not explain for weeks. Panther crews began reporting to 2nd Panzer Division headquarters that they had encountered a full American armored division. Tanks everywhere, firing from the left flank, then vanishing, appearing on the right seconds later. Another shot, another kill, another disappearance. The Germans were seeing ghosts. They were not wrong about the killing. They were very wrong about the numbers. There was no division at Noville. There was a reinforced battalion, a 26-year-old major, some paratroopers from the 506th Parachute Infantry Regiment, and a handful of M18 Hellcats that could move faster than a German turret could turn. That arithmetic, the relationship between speed and turret traverse, is what this whole story comes down to. And if you understand that arithmetic, you understand why 18 tons of almost nothing could make the most feared tanks in the world look helpless. But to understand that morning, you need to go back 3 years, to a man who had an idea that everyone thought was insane. In 1941, a lieutenant colonel named Andrew Davis Bruce took command of the Tank Destroyer Tactical and Firing Center at Fort Meade, Maryland. Bruce was a practical man from the War Department's G3 section, not a theorist, not an academic. His job was to figure out how to stop German panzers, and the Blitzkrieg had just made that the most urgent question in the American army. France had fallen in 6 weeks, Poland before that, the Low Countries. Every engagement told the same story. Allied tanks met German armor head-on and died. The French had good tanks. The Char B1 had perfectly adequate armor and a perfectly adequate gun. It did not matter. Those machines burned in ditches because they fought the way conventional wisdom said you fight panzers. Stand and trade blows, absorb punishment, hit back harder. The conventional wisdom was filling graves. Bruce studied every one of those engagements. He pulled apart the after-action reports. He analyzed kill ratios, engagement distances, tactical dispositions, and he reached a conclusion that contradicted everything the army believed. You do not fight tanks with tanks. Not head-on. Not by building a bigger, heavier, slower vehicle to slug it out with a Panther or a Tiger. German tanks had thick frontal armor and powerful guns, but they had a weakness that no amount of frontal plate could compensate for. Their turrets were slow. The Tiger I used a hydraulic traverse driven off the main engine's gearbox. At high RPM, the turret could complete a full rotation in about 60 seconds. Reasonable enough. But tanks do not fight at high RPM. They fight at idle, stationary, or crawling. At idle, that same Tiger turret took up to 4 minutes for a full rotation. And if the hydraulics failed, the crew had to hand crank 720 turns of the handwheel for 1 revolution. The Panther was better, but still flawed. At combat idle, traversing 90 degrees took 15 to 20 seconds. Bruce looked at those numbers and saw opportunity. A fast vehicle could flank a panzer before its turret came around, punch around into the thin side armour, kill the tank, and vanish before the rest of the column could react. It did not need heavy armour, because heavy armour meant heavy weight, and heavy weight meant the turret caught you. What it needed was the speed to stay ahead of the gun barrel. A puncher, not a slugger. A cruiser, not a battleship. The army thought Bruce was insane. The whole point of armoured vehicles was the armour. Brigadier General Leslie McNair told him the concept would get men killed for nothing. Bruce's answer, as one of his aides later recalled, was simple. The current approach was already getting men killed for nothing, and at least his way, they could shoot back on the move. It was an argument that nobody in Washington wanted to hear, because it required admitting that the existing doctrine was broken. The M3 gun motor carriage, which was basically a 75mm gun bolted onto the back of a half-track, had been tried in North Africa and found pathetically inadequate. The M10, based on the Sherman chassis, was reliable, but too slow and too heavy for Bruce's vision. He wanted something that could outrun a tank, not just outshoot one. He objected formally to every heavy, slow solution the Ordnance Department proposed. He even rejected the M36, which carried a 90mm gun, because it was still just an M10 with a bigger weapon and no more speed. Bruce was not interested in bigger guns. He was interested in geometry. Geometry meant speed. Speed meant flanking. Flanking meant hitting side armour. And side armour, on every German tank in the field, was less than half as thick as the front. You did not need a 90mm gun to penetrate 40mm of side plate. You needed a 76mm gun and the speed to get there before the turret turned. They built the vehicle anyway. Buick Motor Division of General Motors got the contract in early 1942. A string of prototypes followed: the T-42, the T-49, the T-67, each shedding weight and gaining speed until the final version, the T-70, became what the world would know as the M18 Hellcat. And here is a detail that still gets me. Buick assigned the project to Harley Earl's design studio, the same people who would later create the tail-finned Cadillacs of the 1950s. They brought a car designer's mind to a tank destroyer, and what they built was unlike anything else in the American arsenal. The M18 weighed 18 tons, a Panther 45, a Tiger 57. They achieved this by stripping the armour to almost nothing. Frontal hull 30mm, turret face 25. For context, a standard M1 Garand fires a 30-06 round that can penetrate about 12mm of steel at range. The Hellcat's hull armour was 1mm past what a rifle could defeat. Everything else went through it. German 75mm rounds did not just penetrate. They went through both sides, in and out, as if the steel were not there. When crews first saw the specifications, they were horrified. Sergeant Raymond Fairey, one of the first men assigned to the M18 program at Camp Hood, told me years later that his platoon sergeant took one look at the armour spec and said, "Gentlemen, I believe they have built us the world's fastest casket." Nobody laughed. They were looking at 13mm of steel and doing the same mental calculation every tanker does. Can this stop what's going to hit me? The answer was no. It could not stop anything. The engine was a Continental R975 radial, the same aircraft power plant used in the Sherman, but in a vehicle half the weight. The result was a power-to-weight ratio that nothing else on tracks could match. Top speed, 55 miles per hour on a road. The fastest tracked armoured fighting vehicle of the Second World War. Buick's publicity department named it the Hellcat. Earl's design team created the logo, a cartoon wildcat biting a crushed tank tread, flanked by the words, "Seek, Strike, Destroy." The crews painted it on their vehicles with a kind of defiant pride. If you were going to drive into combat in something a heavy machine gun could kill, you wanted at least to do it with some teeth showing. Now I need to give you the numbers, because the numbers are the whole story. At 30 miles per hour, not top speed, An M18 covered 44 feet per second. In the time a Panther needed to traverse 90 degrees, a Hellcat travelled over 660 feet. That is 220 yards of lateral movement, while the German gunner was still cranking his traverse wheel, watching through his optic as the target slid farther and farther ahead of his crosshairs. He had two choices: lead the target and hope it maintained course, or track it and watch his shells land where it used to be. Either way, he was probably going to miss, and he was only going to get one shot, because while he was traversing, that Hellcat was lining up a 76mm M1A1 round on his side armour. The Panther's flank was 80mm. The M18's gun could penetrate 88 at 2,000 metres. At the point-blank ranges the Ardennes fog imposed, the geometry was lethal. One shot, one kill, then gone. But geometry is clean, war is not. The M18 had an open-top turret, no roof. In winter, that meant freezing rain pouring directly onto you, soaking your uniform, numbing your hands on the controls. It meant sniper fire from any elevated position. It meant that an artillery airburst, or a mortar round, did not need a direct hit. Shrapnel rained down into the fighting compartment, directly onto the men. I watched men die from fragments that would have bounced off the roof of a Sherman. In the Hellcat, there was no roof, just sky and metal falling out of it. We had 5 men in each vehicle: commander, turret left rear, gunner, turret left front, loader on the right, driver, hull left, assistant driver, hull right. 5 men in an 18-ton box with an open top and the thinnest armour in the war. To fire the 50 caliber Browning mounted on top, the commander had to stand and expose himself from the waist up, in combat, against everything. Private First Class Eddie Kowalski, who served in our battalion's Company B, told me once that the first time he stood up to man the 50 in training, his sergeant yelled at him to get back down. When Kowalski pointed out that somebody had to fire it, the sergeant said, "Son, that is what we call a career decision." Dark humour. That was how you survived in a Hellcat. You laughed because the alternative was thinking too hard about what you were sitting in. Now I need to take you to December 1944. The Wehrmacht threw everything it had left into the Ardennes. 3 armies, 25 divisions, over 400,000 men. Hitler's gamble. Reach the Meuse, split the Allied armies, capture Antwerp, force a negotiated peace. It was desperate and insane, and for about 72 hours it very nearly worked. The 705th Tank Destroyer Battalion was in reserve 60 miles north of Bastogne when the offensive hit. We were under 9th Army, equipped with M18s, under the command of Lieutenant Colonel Clifford D. Templeton. Templeton was a professional, quiet, precise, the kind of officer who knew his equipment down to the last bolt and his men down to their hometowns. He came from a career army family, had a way of giving orders that made you feel like he was letting you in on a plan rather than telling you what to do. General Andrew Bruce himself had once called the 705th the finest tank destroyer battalion yet trained. That was high praise from the man who invented our reason for existing. On the evening of December 18th, the order came: move south, join 8th Corps at Bastogne, provide anti-tank support to the 101st Airborne Division, which had no armour of its own and was about to be surrounded by 3 German divisions. We drove through the night on roads clogged with retreating units, broken vehicles, disoriented men walking west with empty eyes. The chaos of a front that had collapsed. We had delays at La Roche, a short engagement where the command group itself was attacked. And by late on the night of December 19th, the command and combat elements of the battalion had arrived in Bastogne. Templeton detached platoons to hold bridges and cover approaches, sent the supply elements west with a single M18 as escort and the instruction to hook up with some big friends. Then he committed the rest of us to the perimeter. A platoon was sent north on the morning of the 20th to reinforce Team Désaubry at Noville. Major William R. de Zobry was 26 years old. Born in Manila, son of a career soldier, Georgetown University man who chose ROTC over West Point, which made him something of a rebel in a military family. Rail-thin, 6'4", 160 pounds. John McManus, the historian, described him as someone whose natural leadership skills had put him in charge of 325 soldiers and 15 Sherman tanks, despite having been in the army only 4 years. His job was to hold Noville, a village on high ground north-northeast of Bastogne, and block the road the 2nd Panzer Division needed for its westward advance toward the Meuse. On the night of December 18th, de Zobry's team rolled into Noville in total darkness. They could not see the terrain they were supposed to defend. The ridges commanding the village, one to the southeast, one running north to northwest, were invisible in the blackness. They set up roadblocks on every road entering the village and put a thin screen of infantry in a circle beyond the buildings. Stragglers from broken units drifted in through the night, most without weapons, none with maps, none able to say where they had last seen the enemy. De Zobry later noted that these men were nearly useless in a fight. When shooting started, most went to the cellars. He could not blame them. Then they waited. Around 0400 on December 19th, Colonel Meinrad von Lauchert's 2nd Panzer Division attacked. Von Lauchert was a competent professional who had commanded armour on the Eastern Front and understood combined arms warfare. He expected to brush through Noville in hours. The fog was total. Engagements happened at distances where you could hear the enemy's engine before you saw his tank. Our tank destroyer men from 2nd Platoon, Company C, 705th, had taken position in the south of Noville. They could see about 100 yards beyond their own guns. They could hear large numbers of enemy tracked vehicles moving toward them through the white nothing. The first hit came fast. A direct round struck one of our tank destroyers, killing Corporal Stephen Cook, the gunner, and wounding several crew members. Cook was 22. He had been a machinist's apprentice in Dayton, Ohio, before he enlisted. He was the first man we lost at Noville, but he would not be the last. For 2 hours, the surviving crews fired in the general direction of where they thought the German armour was massing. No targets visible, just the sound of engines and tracks grinding through frozen earth. Then, at 1000, December 20th, the fog quite suddenly lifted. The sky became almost clear, and there, in the fields within view, were 15 German tanks pulling back toward their own lines at about 1,000 yards. One crew spotted a tiger among them, took the shot, hit it. The tiger stopped, began to smoke, was abandoned. Our men later inspected it. The radio inside was still crackling, busy with German chatter on an open channel. Before anyone at the command post could find a German speaker, the channel went dead. Colonel Roberts, when he heard about it, gave them hell for not towing the tiger back to Bastogne. They had a good excuse. They did not have enough drivers left for their own vehicles. 2 M18s were already without full crews. Major Robert Harwick, a paratrooper who had assumed overall command after Laprade was killed, asked if any of his infantrymen could drive tanks. 2 paratroopers climbed into Shermans. Both were killed during the withdrawal. I never learned their names. I wish I had. De Zobry, meanwhile, was fighting for his life on the phone. He had been holding off elements of the 2nd Panzer Division since 0400 with 325 soldiers and 15 Shermans. German artillery was pounding the village. Buildings that were not already burning were shaking from the salvos. De Zobry called Colonel William Roberts at the Hotel Lebrun in Bastogne and asked permission to withdraw. The sounds of battle reverberated against the headquarters walls as Roberts considered. He told de Zobry to hold the line. What followed, de Zobry later said, was the longest minute of his life. He stood there with the phone pressed to his ear, listening to shells landing outside, calculating whether his men would live or die based on what the voice on the other end said next. Roberts came back and said, "You can use your own judgment about withdrawing, but I am sending a battalion of paratroopers to reinforce you." 500 airborne soldiers from the 1st Battalion, 506th PIR, under Lieutenant Colonel James Leprade. And de Sobry, 26 years old, outnumbered by an entire Panzer Division, decided not only to stay, but to attack. What had started as a holding action became a 2-day battle that would help decide the fate of the entire German offensive. Leprade arrived with his paratroopers at 11:30 on December 19th. He and de Sobry agreed on a defence plan, combining armour and infantry in a perimeter that used the village buildings as cover and the roads as kill zones. It was improvised, desperate, and it worked, until it could not work anymore. The Hellcats went to work. The technique the 705th developed at Noville was the purest expression of what Andrew Bruce had imagined 3 years earlier. A Hellcat would race to a street corner, the edge of a building, a gap between stone walls. The crew would spot a Panther through the thinning fog. The gunner would lay crosshairs on the flank, the flat expanse of thinner armour between the road wheels and the turret ring. One shot. The 76mm round left the barrel at nearly 2,600 feet per second. At the ranges we were fighting, inside a few hundred yards, the time between firing and impact was less than the time it takes to blink. Then, full reverse at maximum speed, the driver already anticipating the order, back behind the building, down an alley, the engines screaming. The loader was already slamming another round into the breach before the vehicle stopped moving. By the time the Panther's turret traversed, the Hellcat was gone. The German gunner would be staring through his optic at an empty street corner. The turret would keep turning, following a target that was no longer there, hunting for something to shoot at, while the Hellcat repositioned 100 yards away, ready to do it again from a different angle. Moments later, the same Hellcat, or another, would appear on the opposite side of the German column. Another shot, another kill, another disappearance. A single Hellcat, working the alleys and intersections of Noville, could engage the same German column from 4 different positions in 3 minutes. To the Germans, that looked like 4 different vehicles. Multiply that by the number of M18s we had in the fight, and you begin to understand how a handful of tank destroyers created the illusion of an armoured division. It must have felt like fighting smoke. You cannot kill smoke. You can only stand in it and die. The reports going back to von Laukert's headquarters grew increasingly frantic. His intelligence officer estimated they were facing an entire American armoured division. When I heard that years later at a veterans conference in 1989, I laughed so hard my chest hurt. A division. They were fighting a reinforced battalion and a handful of Hellcats, whose speed made them appear to be everywhere at once. At that same conference, I spoke with a former sergeant from the 2nd Panzer Division named Klaus Ritter. He had been a loader in a Panther that morning at Noville. He told me that his commander had ordered a halt 3 times because he believed they were being flanked by a large armoured force. Ritter said, "We could hear them everywhere. The engines, then the shot, then nothing, then the engines somewhere else. We thought there were hundreds." I told him there might have been a dozen. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "A dozen vehicles did that to us." I said, "Your turrets were too slow." He looked at me and nodded. He had figured that out, he said, about 40 years too late. But speed could not save everyone. You need to hear that part, because the story without the cost is not the story. Any hit on a Hellcat was usually fatal. There was no wounded in a Hellcat the way there was wounded in a Sherman, where the armour might absorb enough energy to save a life. A German 75mm round came through one wall and went out the other. If you were in the path, you were dead. Crews who got caught in the open, who misjudged their timing by 2 seconds, who turned left when they should have turned right, died. The open turret meant that artillery airbursts dropped shrapnel directly into the fighting compartment. No roof to stop it, just sky and metal falling from it. I remember one morning when a mortar barrage caught two of our vehicles in a village square. One of the drivers, a kid from Minnesota named Fredrickson, managed to reverse out. The other vehicle took a direct hit. The 705th alone was credited with 24 kills, including several Tigers. The village eventually fell. The American force was too small to hold against the full weight of a Panzer Division, and the withdrawal through Foy was a nightmare of burning Shermans, blocked roads, and German guns firing into a retreating column. But they had bought time. Critical hours for the 101st Airborne to establish the defensive perimeter that would hold Bastogne. The delay at Noville threw the 2nd Panzer Division off its timetable by at least 48 hours. That division, which was supposed to race west to the Meuse, got tangled up and ultimately ran out of fuel at Celle, where the US 2nd Armored Division destroyed it. The disruption at Noville cascaded all the way to the end of the offensive. A dozen Hellcats and a handful of Shermans had cost the 2nd Panzer its schedule, and schedule was the one thing the German offensive could not afford to lose. Throughout the siege of Bastogne that followed, the 705th was distributed among the 101st regiments like a thin steel membrane stretched across every point where German armour might break through. A platoon to the 501st Parachute Infantry, 2 to the 506th, 2 to the 502nd, 4 to the 327th Glider Infantry, 1 platoon in reserve in the town itself. We were the only significant anti-tank capability the 101st had. The paratroopers were among the finest infantry in the American Army, but they had no tanks, and a bazooka is a close-range weapon that requires a man to stand in the open and fire at an approaching panzer from a distance where the panzer can see him clearly. That takes extraordinary courage, but courage is not a substitute for a 76mm gun that can kill a tank at 1,000 yards. On December 21st, the total armoured reserve in Bastogne, apart from us, was about 40 operable medium tanks from the battered remains of CCB, 10th Armoured, and CCR, 9th Armoured, 40 Shermans, and our open-topped Hellcats against everything the Wehrmacht could throw. Brigadier General Gerald Higgins, the Assistant Division Commander acting for McAuliffe, later said that without the 705th, the 101st would have had to fight panzers with bazookas and prayers. I do not know if he was exaggerating. I do know that by Christmas, we had been fighting continuously for 5 days, sleeping in shifts inside our vehicles, eating whatever we could find, burning fuel we could not replace. The supply situation was critical. We had been surrounded since December 21st. Nothing was getting through. Ammunition was rationed. The artillerymen were down to 10 rounds per gun per day. We counted our 76mm rounds the way a thirsty man counts sips of water. On Christmas Day, 18 Panzer IVs from the 15th Panzer Grenadier Division attacked the northwestern sector. The German armour came in with infantry, a coordinated assault. M18s from the 705th broke up the attack. The paratroopers of the 502nd fought hand-to-hand in village streets, while Hellcats darted between buildings, placing shots into the flanks of panzers focused on the infantry ahead of them. Colonel Patrick Cassidy of the 1st Battalion 502nd PIR commanded the defence at that point. He later described the Hellcats as the damnedest things he ever saw, racing between buildings like hot rods at a county fair, except every time they stopped, a German tank blew up. Every one of those 18 panzers was destroyed or driven back. In another action, a tank destroyer platoon used ground flares to illuminate and destroy 3 panzers reinforcing a night assault. Ground flares. We were lighting up the battlefield ourselves, in open vehicles, knowing that every flare that showed us the enemy also showed the enemy exactly where we sat. The flare goes up, the field turns white. There is the Panzer, maybe 200 yards out, hull silhouetted against the snow. The gunner has 3 seconds to lay crosshairs and fire before the Panzer sees the light source and traverses. 3 seconds. In December, in an open turret. So you fire the flare and take the shot and pray your driver is already in reverse. By the time the siege was lifted, the 705th had destroyed around 40 German tanks in and around Bastogne. We lost 6 Hellcats. 6. 40 to 6. The battalion received the Presidential Unit Citation. Eisenhower himself singled us out, though he mistakenly described us as having 90mm tank destroyers. We had 76mm guns. Nobody corrected him. You do not correct Eisenhower. Templeton survived the bulge. He kept commanding the 705th through the attachment to Combat Command B of the 11th Armoured Division and the grinding drive into Germany. They crossed the Kiel River, pushed toward the Rhine, fought through March in engagements the history books barely mention because they were not Bastogne. Small actions. Villages nobody remembers. German rearguards that fought and fell back and fought again. The Hellcats did what they had always done. Moved fast, hit flanks, disappeared. It was the same doctrine, the same geometry, just pointed east instead of west. On March 1st, 1945, an artillery shell struck Templeton's command post. It was not aimed at him. It was not part of a deliberate attack on his position. It was simply a round that the laws of ballistics delivered to a particular point in space at a particular moment in time, and he happened to be standing at that point. Lieutenant Colonel Clifford D. Templeton was killed in action. He was succeeded by Major John Dibble. I did not learn the full details of his death until years later, at a reunion in the 1960s, when Sergeant First Class Harold Myers, who had been at the CP that day, told me what happened. Myers said it was fast. Templeton did not suffer. I do not know if that is true or if Myers was being kind. It does not matter. He was gone. At the time, in March 1945, we were told only that the CO was killed, that there was a new CO, and that we were crossing the Kill on the 6th. That is how war works. A man who held Bastogne together was dead, and the river crossing was on schedule. War does not grieve. It does not pause for the loss of good men. It just keeps moving, and it expects you to keep moving with it. And if you stop to feel the weight of who you have lost, the war will move on without you. The 705th crossed the Rhine at Oppenheim on March 29th and pushed through southern Germany in April, through Bayreuth into Austria, reaching Neukirchen by May 6th. The battalion was inactivated in July 1945, its war over. 48 men killed during 1 year in Europe, 30 of those 48 at Bastogne. That ratio, 30 out of 48, tells you everything about what those December weeks cost us. Nearly 2/3 of every man we lost in a single month, in a single place, in vehicles with the thinnest armour in the Allied arsenal. But the Hellcat story did not end at Bastogne. 4 months later, and 1,000 miles south, a different battalion proved what these vehicles could do in a completely different way. The 805th Tank Destroyer Battalion was the only unit in Italy fully equipped with M18s. They had come a longer road than most to get there. Formed from the 105th Anti-Tank Battalion in December 1941, they were among the first tank destroyer units to see combat. Shipped to North Africa in January 1943, they fought at Kasserine Pass that February, where Rommel's panzers tore through American lines, and the 805th took heavy casualties. It was a brutal education. They re-equipped with M10s, fought at El Ghouta in March, then converted to towed 3-inch guns and shipped to Italy. Monte Cassino, Anzio, The grinding, blood-soaked stalemate of the Italian front. Then finally, in the summer of 1944, they received M18 Hellcats, the only Hellcats in the entire Mediterranean theatre. Their commander by war's end was Major Herbert B. Fowler. The crews painted unauthorized insignia on their turrets, a black cat biting a tank on an orange disc. Command told them to remove the markings. They refused. Captain Baker Newton, who had served in the battalion through both M10s and M18s, wrote a personal assessment comparing the two vehicles at the request of the Army Ground Forces Board. He praised the Hellcat's speed, its ease of maintenance, the engine mounted on steel rollers for quick removal, the reliability of the Tortmatic automatic transmission, and its ability to traverse mud and snow that bogged heavier vehicles. But he was honest about the cost. The crew felt naked. That was his word, naked. The men of the 805th wore their black cat with a kind of fierce pride. If they were going to drive the most fragile armoured vehicles in Italy, they would do it with their own mark painted on the hull. Orders be damned. In April 1945, the Allies launched the Spring Offensive in Italy. After months of grinding through the Apennine Mountains, fighting through mud and stone and fortified Gothic line positions that the Germans had turned into killing grounds, months where the 805th had been used mostly for indirect fire missions, lobbing shells over ridgelines like artillery, rather than hunting tanks the way Bruce intended, the Po Valley opened up ahead like a billiard table. Flat, open, no hedgerows, no forests, no mountain passes. The kind of terrain a Hellcat was born for. And the Germans were retreating. Not withdrawing in good order, running. Columns of trucks, half-tracks, tanks, horse-drawn wagons, staff cars, ambulances, everything the Wehrmacht had left in Italy, streaming north toward the Alps in a desperate attempt to reach Austria before the Americans cut them off. The soldiers called what happened next the rat race. The 805th found themselves doing something no tank destroyer unit had done before, driving parallel to retreating German columns. Not behind them, beside them. At 30 miles per hour, they pulled alongside, close enough to see the expressions on the faces of German drivers who had not expected anything moving that fast from the west, and opened fire. The 76mm guns raking trucks, half-tracks and armoured vehicles from the flank. The sound was enormous. The bark of the main gun, the roar of the Continental engine, the clatter of brass casings hitting the turret floor, the shouts of the loader calling out that the next round was seated. German gunners on their half-tracks and tank turrets frantically cranked to bring weapons around. But the geometry was the same geometry that had killed Panthers at Noville 5 months earlier. By the time a gun came to bear, the Hellcat was already far down the column, or had cut away across a field and was coming back at the column from a different direction. I spoke to men from the 805th at reunions over the years. Staff Sergeant William Ertel, who later became president of the Tank Destroyer Society, described the Po Valley chase as the most surreal experience of his life. Speeding past enemy infantry too stunned to fire, the wind through the open turret, the feeling of being in a hunt rather than a battle. He told me the strangest part was the speed. In the mountains they had crawled, weeks to gain a mile. In the Po Valley they covered 50 miles in a day, and the enemy was right there beside them the whole time, running in the same direction, unable to stop it. Because the 805th was the only Hellcat unit in the theatre, German intelligence was baffled. A black cat spotted outside Bologna in the morning would be reported 50 miles north by afternoon. They concluded there were multiple Hellcat units operating across the front. There was one. The pursuit moved so fast, the 805th could not guard captured prisoners. They disarmed the Germans and pointed them south, then kept moving. There was no time to process prisoners, no time to establish holding areas, no time for the ordinary bureaucracy of war. You took their weapons, pointed them in a direction, and drove on. Some of those German soldiers had been fighting since North Africa, since Stalingrad, since the beginning. They stood in Italian roads in April sunshine and watched an American vehicle they had never seen before disappear north at a speed they could not comprehend, and then turned south and started walking. I think about what that must have been like for them, to have fought for years, survived everything the war could throw, and then be disarmed by a crew in a vehicle moving so fast it could not even stop long enough to take you prisoner properly. That is how armies end. Not in a single decisive battle, in the accumulation of moments when the thing you are fighting for stops making sense, and the enemy's machinery moves faster than your ability to resist it. An officer from the 805th told me he captured a German Hauptmann, a captain, near Verona. The captain spoke decent English and asked what kind of vehicle that was. When told it was an M18 Hellcat, the captain shook his head and said, "We never saw this in the intelligence reports." "How fast does it go?" 55 miles per hour, the officer said. The captain closed his eyes. He said, "We were trying to outrun you in horse carts." On April 21st, attached to the 34th Infantry Division, the 805th helped capture Bologna. Then, with the 88th Infantry Division, they drove toward the Brenner Pass. The mountains rose again, the Alps white-capped and impassable, the German retreat compressing into narrow passes and final surrenders. The war in Italy ended, with the 805th still moving, the Black Cat still on their turrets. By the end of the war, M18 Hellcats across all theatres had compiled 526 confirmed kills, 498 in Europe, 17 in Italy, 11 in the Pacific. The overall exchange ratio was 2.4 to 1, better than anything else the Americans fielded. The M10 was a competent vehicle, but it was slow. The Sherman was versatile, but it was not designed to hunt tanks. The M36 had a magnificent 90mm gun, but it arrived too late in numbers to change the picture. The Hellcat, with its thin skin and its absurd speed, had the best kill ratio of them all. Historian Stephen Zaloga, whose scholarship I respect, called the M18 a poorly balanced design. He argued that the combat record was attributable to the training and dedication of crews, not to the vehicle. He may have been right that the men were exceptional. They were trained by Bruce's Tank Destroyer Center at Camp Hood, Texas, drilled in the doctrine of speed and flanking until it was reflex. Put those men in Shermans, and they might have fought well too. But here is what that analysis misses, and I say it with respect. Those men chose how to fight. They chose flanking, hit and run, shoot and scoot, because the Hellcat allowed those tactics. A Sherman would have forced different choices. Head-on engagements against Panthers at ranges where the German 75mm outperformed the American 76mm. Slug matches against Tigers, where the Tiger's 88mm could kill a Sherman at 2,000 meters, and the Sherman could barely scratch a Tiger's front at 500. Different tactics that favored German advantages in armor and gun caliber. The M18 did not make us brave. It gave our nerve a shape, a set of possibilities that heavier, slower vehicles could not offer. It let us choose the terms of the fight, instead of accepting the enemy's terms. And the terms we chose, speed over armor, position over protection, killed more Germans per vehicle lost than any other American approach to armored warfare in the entire war. The numbers do not lie, even if the doctrine that produced them was abandoned. After the war, the M18 was retired almost immediately. The tank destroyer doctrine fell out of favor. The army decided the future belonged to heavily armored main battle tanks, the M26 Pershing, later the M48 Patton, and the M60. The cruiser philosophy was abandoned. The official history concluded that tank destroyers had been a mistake, that their functions could be performed by tanks, that the whole concept of trading armour for speed was fundamentally flawed. I read that conclusion in the 1950s, and it made my blood boil. They were reading engagement reports compiled by officers who had never sat inside an M18. They were analysing kill ratios without understanding what it felt like to be inside a vehicle where every second of stillness was a second closer to death. They looked at the thin armour and saw a design flaw. We looked at the thin armour and saw a reason to move faster. The M18s were sold off to Yugoslavia, Venezuela, other countries that kept them running into the 1990s. A vehicle designed in 1942, still rolling half a century later, because some small army on a tight budget looked at Bruce's numbers and decided they still added up. There was a quiet vindication in that. Generals with unlimited budgets abandoned the Hellcat. Armies that counted every dollar kept it running. I went back to Belgium in 1994 for the 50th anniversary of the Bulge. I stood in Noville. The village had been rebuilt. The stone buildings shattered by shell fire in December 1944 were whole again, neat and quiet, with flower boxes in the windows. The streets where Hellcats had raced between walls, engines echoing, were peaceful lanes where children rode bicycles. I walked to where 2nd Platoon had been positioned, where Cook had died, where we had fired blind into fog. It was a spring morning, clear sky, you could see for miles, no fog, no engines, just birdsong and wind and the distant hum of a tractor. There was a Belgian man, older, who came out of his house and saw me standing in the road. He asked, in French, if I was lost. I told him, in my terrible French, that I had been here before, in 1944. His face changed. He took my hand and held it with both of his, and did not say anything for a long time. Then he took me inside and gave me coffee, and showed me a photograph on his wall. American soldiers, taken in September 1944, when Noville had first been liberated. The civilians cheering, the Americans smiling. Nobody in that photograph knew the Germans would come back 3 months later. It was a moment of joy, frozen in black and white, before the world turned again. He asked me, through broken French and gestures, about our vehicles. I tried to explain. Fast, I said. Very fast. Very thin. He understood what mattered. He said, "You came back for us. When the Germans returned, you came back." I told him we did. I did not tell him about the men who did not come back from Noville. That was not a conversation for coffee and old photographs. I visited a restored M18 at the Sloan Museum in Flint, Michigan, where Buick had been based, where the assembly line once ran 3 shifts. Bill Gross, the historian who restored it, called it the hot rod of World War II. That made me laugh. A hot rod with a 76mm cannon and no roof. I put my hand on the hull, warm from the museum lights. In December 1944, that steel was so cold, bare skin stuck to it. You learned to wear your gloves. A woman walked by with her children and asked if I knew what it was. He spent the rest of the war as a prisoner at Fallingbostel, a branch of the Belgian camp. He did not know until liberation what his 2 days at Noville had meant. That the perimeter held, the Bastogne held, that the offensive broke itself against the crossroads he had been ordered to defend when he was 26 and terrified. He survived, stayed in the army, rose to lieutenant general, commanded the 1st Armoured Division, then the Armour Centre at Fort Knox, chaired the tank task force that led to the M1 Abrams. He died in 1996. The road between Noville and Bourcy was renamed Rue du Général des Aupuis. I met him once, at a reunion in the 1980s. He was tall, still thin, still had the look of a man carrying something heavy that nobody else could see. I shook his hand and told him I had been at Noville. He looked at me for a long moment. Then he said, quietly, that he had thought about Noville every day since December 1944. Not the battle itself, he said. The phone call. The moment Roberts told him to hold the line, and he held the phone and listened to shells falling outside and calculated whether his men would live or die based on what the voice on the other end said next. That was what stayed with him. Not the fighting, the waiting. I believed him. I have my own version of that moment. Every veteran does. The seconds before the thing happens, when you still have time to think and wish you did not. And I met Klaus Ritter one more time after that conference in Germany. He had travelled to Bastogne for a memorial dedication. He stood in Noville, the same village his Panther had attacked 45 years earlier, and he looked at the rebuilt houses and the flowers and the quiet streets. He said to me, in his careful English, "It is so peaceful now. I cannot believe we tried to destroy this place." I said, "I cannot believe we managed to stop you." He smiled. We were two old men standing on a road in Belgium, 80 years of living between us, and the morning when his turret was too slow and my vehicle was fast enough. And the only thing that separated us was which side of that equation we had been on. I am 93. There are not many of us left. The men who drove Hellcats, who sat in open turrets in December rain and April sunshine, who bet their lives every morning on the proposition that speed could keep them alive long enough to kill the thing trying to kill them. Most of them are gone now. Templeton is gone. Des Aubry is gone. Cook has been gone for 80 years. Sergeant Fari, who told me about his platoon sergeant's casket joke at Camp Hood, he passed in 2008. The men of the 805th, who painted black cats on their turrets and drove through the Po Valley past stunned German infantry, they are almost all gone. Otel, who described the rat race to me in Kansas City, he is gone too. When I stand next to that M18 in the museum, I'm standing next to a piece of steel that was supposed to be too thin, too light, too fragile to survive a war. It survived. Many of the men inside it did not. That is the truth of the Hellcat. Not pride exactly, not grief. The weight of knowing that the fastest vehicle in the war was also the most dangerous place to sit. And we drove them anyway, because somebody had to. And the arithmetic said it would work. And the men who trusted that arithmetic were brave. And the men who died inside it deserve to be remembered by name, not as footnotes. This channel exists to tell these stories before there is no one left to tell them. If they matter to you, subscribe and stay for the next one. Leave a comment. If your father or grandfather served, tell me something they told you about the war. Those kitchen table stories matter as much as any battle. A like helps others find this, and these men deserve to be found. Thank you for sitting with me. There are more to tell.